All right,
Take it away.
hello. Thank you very much for having me. And what I'm going to talk about today is solving that dev database problem. So I am guessing that you have had problems with your development databases. Maybe you've not had up-to-date data to play with. If you don't have realistic data when you're developing your code, then how can you be blamed if it breaks in weird ways when you get to production? Because you've never had the experience of working with production data. But then we have the problem that production data is often too big. It probably doesn't fit on your laptop. And that is going to cause you problems. And even if it did, would you really want, I mean, how big do you want your laptop to be when you're going through security? And then we have the data privacy issue. For the Americans watching, we care a lot about that over here. And I know you care about that too. And various regulations and things have passed recently, which means it's just not cool to stick sensitive production data in development databases anymore. There's the principle of minimization and making sure that we're using our data for the purpose it's given to us for. And I'm sorry, that probably doesn't include development and test purposes. At least you'll be hard pushed to make that case. So I'm going to talk about how we can create realistic dev data in a dev domain. I'm not going to talk too much about masking the production data. So that's a separate session, and I'm sure you'll be able to look at sessions elsewhere. So the point at which we're picking this up is somebody has created a masked data set for us. So that's probably a production backup that's had some scripts run on it to clean up all the names and addresses and things and make them anonymous, at which point we can hopefully have a production data set that has been masked. So that's still a job that I'm not going to teach you how to do in this session. You need to go and do that yourselves. But then we still have the problem that it's really, really big. And how do I put that in dev? Now, one answer to that is to have a shared development server. But that's a terrible idea for various reasons I'm going to go through into. One thing before we get started is I do want to make an admission. I did everything I could to get this to work with PS Database Clone. I was really excited about PS Database Clone. And there are various reasons that I will get to, which meant that I wasn't quite happy with that demo, which does mean that in the space of PS Database Clone, I am going to be using one of the alternative solutions. And if there was another open source solution, I would be using it, but there isn't, which means that it is going to be it was a choice of either Redgate or Windocs, and I went for Redgate. So we are going to be using Redgate SQL Clone for this rather than PS Database Clone, but we are still going to be using SSDT, and we are still going to be using GitHub, and we're still going to be using Docker, and we're still going to be using Azure DevOps Services and SQL Server. So I do have to apologize for that. There were various reasons I'll get to why the PS Database Clone just didn't work yet. I don't think it's quite ready yet, but there's a huge amount of potential in it. So I'll talk about the huge potential that's there, and I will encourage people to get involved. Let's get underway. First of all, I'll tell you a bit about what I've been doing recently. I've been on the road with SQL Relay, where I'm talking to you from the conference. So I've stolen one of our 2 speaker rooms and said, sorry, I'm doing a GroupBy session at this time. Everybody go to the other speaker room. And so you've got us on the road at SQL Relay. What is SQL Relay? Well, it's literally a bunch of speakers get on a bus and we travel from place to place and do sessions every single day. So this session has been put together in between co-organizing this event, as well as speaking at it, as well as managing all the sponsors. So that's our sponsor hall. That's directly upstairs from where I am right now. This was at the beginnings, just as people were arriving. And I also am still in the process of continuously writing up my T-SQL Tuesday write-up. T-SQL Tuesday was yesterday. There's a whole bunch of amazing blog posts here about changing your mind. However, let's get back to the session at hand. So what we want to do is provision development databases, but I have no time anymore for shared development databases. You've maybe worked with shared development databases before, and that's what these guys were doing. And this is a blog post I wrote a little while ago, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about shared versus dedicated because I've made my feelings known. I've blogged about these in the past, so head to my blog, workingwithdevs.com, shared versus dedicated, if you want to read all about this. But why do I hate the shared database model so much? Well, first of all, up here, this is genuinely a, when I was with this customer, this is genuinely a whiteboard that we drew behind ourselves. And you've got all of these databases in the old way of working on the left-hand side using the shared DevDB, which they themselves labeled the Wild West. Why was it the Wild West? Well, you had all sorts of old test code written there. You had code that was kind of half written, never really worked out. You had 3 or 4 features being developed in tandem. Sometimes there were dependencies between different features, sometimes there weren't. The ordering was really important. Did development match production? Of course it didn't. Did it work in development? Of course it worked in development. It never worked on production. And all of these issues were really, really painful. And when you try and start source controlling those changes, that becomes painful as well, because you're forever cherry picking. You've got a long list of changes that have happened on the development database. Did I do this thing? Did I do this thing? Don't forget, like if you've got to pick a random 9 changes out of a list of 30, I mean, are you always going to get it all right? No, sometimes you're going to make a mistake. You'll forget that change that you made, or you'll accidentally include somebody else's change. Or maybe 2 of you have changed the same object, and now you can't submit your change without somebody else's change. It's a right mess. And also, if anybody breaks that development database, they've broken it for everybody. At this organization, genuinely, there was a time where somebody had accidentally dropped all the users from the development database, which had locked 100 developers out of the development database for the entire day. Why did it take the whole day? Because the DBAs were worrying about a production issue at the time. And I'm sorry, production is always going to trump dev, which means developers have huge lead times whenever they want anything changed on the development server. Frankly, DBAs owning development servers is an anti-pattern. We need to get away from it. DBAs need to look after production servers, look after them. That's where they need their focus to be. They need to not be distracted by having to maintain your development servers. I'm sorry, developers, you need to learn to do a little bit of administration yourself and look after your own development servers. You know what? Maybe it will mean that we'll begin to understand each other's jobs a little bit better and allow us to collaborate a little bit better. Yeah, I made in this post of here are some examples of some things that I often see. Oops, Bob broke the database. Now the entire dev team are disrupted because they all depend on it. Oops, Mary forgot to commit her changes to source control, and so on and so forth. I'll let you read this in your own time. So what we want to do is we want every developer to have their own, ideally their own instance with their own databases that they can play with. That sounds great. SQL Server Developer Edition is now kind of fully featured and available for development use. So we can do that from a licensing perspective. And we can install SQL Server on a laptop. That's great. But then we run into problems because do you install SQL Server by clicking next, next, next? Do you accept all the default settings? What do the different developers set it up differently? Now all of a sudden your development environment doesn't look like my development environment, so the testing isn't consistent. So what can we do about that? Well, one thing we could do, and certainly this is a great idea, is automating your SQL Server installation. And there's a blog post here by Bob Walker from Octopus Deploy. Actually, you know what? Bob Walker is in this photo at the top. This is actually unplanned. I'd forgotten about this. The way it's a fun way, the way circles, the way worlds collide. This photo was taken when I went to see him a few years ago at Farm Credit Services of America when he was working there as a lead developer. And while I was there, I introduced him to a little tool called Octopus Deploy. Well, now he works at Octopus Deploy as a solutions architect. So it's funny the way the wheels turn. Anyway, one of the things that he did, I'm not sure whether it was at Farm Credit or one of his other jobs that he's had, is he automated the installation of SQL Server. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically you create this file, this .ini file, and then it effectively allows you to run from a script. It allows you to install SQL Server with a source controlled set of parameters. So now you know all the developers are setting it up in the same way. They've got the same configuration. You're not accidentally going to have issues where they set it up with different collations, and then when they commit their code to source control, suddenly you're changing the collation on all of this sort of stuff that goes on. You're not going to have that anymore. So that's great. That's definitely a step in the right direction. But can we do better than that? So a few years ago, I started talking to a guy who's now a good friend of mine, Andrew Prusky. Let's go back again, the way the world turns. Andrew Prusky, actually you can't see him. He's sat behind me hiding in that photo. He's one of the co-organizers of Data Relay now. And Andrew Prusky really made containers properly accessible to me. So a couple of years ago, they were first coming out, these container things. What are containers? How does SQL Server work with these? That's Linuxy stuff. It doesn't live in my world. Well, actually, they're really, really cool. Remember when VMs came along and everyone was like, I'll never run SQL Server in a VM? Well, you did, didn't you? Because they're a lot easier to manage. Well, containers are kind of the same thing. They're a bit like a VM, but we're not just sharing the hardware, we're also sharing the operating system. And that means they're much, much smaller, much, much lighter, and ultimately I can spin them up much, much more quickly. I can tear them down much more quickly. I can fit far more of them on a piece of hardware, especially in the age of cloud computing, where we're paying for the amount of resources that we're using on big data centers. Shrinking the footprint of the stuff that you're using is amazing. It means that I can run many versions of the thing in parallel on a machine. It means that I can run many more instances of SQL Server on my machine. And this is great because now I'm not just thinking about the amount of resources I need on my machine to run my production estate is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And also, it's really quick to get started up. So my first demo, I'm going to show you how quickly to get started. Now, Andrew Prusky's series is amazing. There's also some great documentation on the Microsoft website. So go check that stuff out. I'm going to jump into PowerShell ISE now, and I've got a few very basic commands that I'm going to run for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is, having installed Docker and done all the stuff, go and read Andrew Prusky's container series. What I'm not going to do, by the way, in this session, I don't think people watch sessions to learn the detail of a thing. I think people go and read blog posts or documentation or read a book to get the detail of the thing. What I'm going to try and do is show you how these things fit together and how they solve a business problem. So forgive me for not going into the detail for that. Go and look at Andrew Prusky's stuff. Also go and look at Anthony Nocentino's stuff. His stuff is great as well. And there are a few other people who are doing really great work in this space. So what I'm going to do is I'm just briefly going to go through and I'm going to show you how powerful this thing can be. So I have, this is all running on my machine. I've got Management Studio here. I've got a local instance. That's a plain old fashioned SQL Server. What I'm going to do is I am going to pull down the latest, if I just run that, I'm going to pull down the latest image from the, of the Microsoft SQL Server on Linux container. By default, it's Linux now. I'm sorry, SQL Server on Linux does feel like the default way. Why is Linux better? Well, frankly, it's smaller is the big thing. It's just so much easier to download. It's a significantly smaller thing. I did actually cheat here. I'd already downloaded it because I didn't think you wanted to watch me while I try and download a Docker image over conference Wi-Fi. So now I can see, if I look at my images, I've got this mcr-microsoft.com MS SQL Server latest image. As I say, the default is Linux. There's a separate one that's called Windows SQL Server or something similar. I can't remember exactly. Go look it up. You'll find it. But the point is the default one, even Microsoft are making the default to be on Linux now. So all of those folks who have actually done some work with Linux in the past, it's coming your way. Next, this is all I need to run to spin up an installation of SQL Server. Now, if I was doing the manual install of the full fat install of SQL Server, it's going to take a while to run because installing SQL Server takes a while, right? Well, what we have here is, let's go through this bit by bit. Docker run. So this is going to spin up a new image. I'm going to run it in detached mode, and I'm going to say I want to run it on a port inside the container. So I'm mapping port 15799 on my machine with port 1433 SQL Server inside the container.
Alex, we can't see the actual demo because we can only see your browser. Someone
Oh,
said you're displaying the quick start. I don't really know what that means. But...
I do apologize for that. Let me show you the screen instead. My apologies. You're right. I was sharing my browser.
Cool.
Thank you very much for bringing
Excellent.
that up. Whoever that was, thank you very much. So just to show you what I did, first of all, I ran Docker pull to bring down the latest image. Then I ran Docker images to show you that I had it locally. The next thing I'm going to do is call Docker run. So Docker run in detached mode using port 15799 against port 133 inside the container. Environment variables, I'm going to accept the EULA, that's a requirement. I'm going to give it an SA password. Yeah, so one of the downsides of containers, and I will say it is a genuine downside of containers, is they don't yet support Windows authentication. It is SQL auth only. That is a bummer, but from what I hear, people are working on it, so I hope that we will get WinAuth at some point soon. We can give it a name, so I'm going to call this container SQL on Linux, and we're doing it from the latest version of the MS SQL Server image. This is the latest SQL on Linux image available from Docker. So let's do this now. How long does it take you to install SQL Server? Well, it takes me that long. It's there. It's available. It's ready for me to connect to. And I can prove that if I connect to localhost. Let me just double check the port. What port did I put it on? 15799. Yep, I think that's right. And I log in with the password devops rocks. Connect. Nope. What have I done? Have I got the wrong port? Let me try that again. Actually, you know what? Let me do it by copy paste. Don't type during demos, folks. Actually, first of all, I'm going to run Docker PS just to double check it's there. Yep, it's there. It's been running for 43 seconds. Let's try this again. There we are. Clearly, I foobarred the keyboard. Right, and there is a fully functioning version of SQL Server inside a Linux container. How quick and easy was that? Now, why does I want it to be quick and easy to set this up? Because like setting up your local environment is a one-time thing, right? No, absolutely not. You want your local environment to be disposable. You want to kill it all of the time, regularly, because what you want to do is you want to be respawning it each time you check out the latest code, each time you start work, each time in the morning. I want to be checking it out locally and building it fresh. And what I want to be doing is building a fresh SQL installation and squirting my databases into there. This takes up next to no resources on disk relative to a full SQL Server instance. It's also not doing anything with my machine because all of the SQL Serverness is isolated inside the container. When I kill that container, off it goes. I don't need to install SQL Server anymore. On my machine, I can install it inside a container, which gives me a nice isolation. And there are also clever things you can do. You can create you can configure exactly how this would run, and you can create Docker files as well, which is a bit like how you would source control, how you want it to look. So you'd create a Docker file in source control, which would create a Docker container in a given format. Again, if you want to go and read the documentation about that, or Andrew or Anthony's blog posts, go do that. I'm not going to cover it in too much detail here. I just want to show you the power and how exciting this is. Because what it means now, I'm beginning to imagine a scenario where I might be able to genuinely move away from those shared database servers and start moving towards consistent local instances, or maybe it's not local, maybe it's on a dev VM jump box or whatever you're using. I don't really mind whether it's on your machine or whether it's on the jump box, but I don't really mind where your code lives. Maybe it's in the cloud, I don't care. But the point is I want it to be disposable. You know why I want it to be disposable? If you can rebuild your code from scratch, from source control, that is amazing in terms of being able to respond to issues, in terms of being able to catch issues. If I'm forcing you to rebuild it from scratch very quickly, you're on a regular basis, you're very quickly going to find out when something's not working. And then you're going to fix it very quickly after that code was introduced. Cool. So that's containers. What I want now is the databases inside them. Now I can do what's called, I can mount a volume in a container. So I can share some of the disk space on my laptop with the container. So that's one thing I could do, but the databases are big. They're still full fat databases. What I want is a way of doing something similar to what I did with the container, where I effectively was able to spin it up really quickly and really easily without taking up too much disk space. I want to be able to do something similar to that with my databases, because I mean, a quick, simple, easy install of SQL Server is one thing, but if I've got a 15 terabyte database, how's that going to work? I don't really want to provision 15 terabytes of storage to all of my developers. So what am I going to do about that? Well, that's where cloning comes in, and that's where PS Database Clone joins the conversation. Now, PS Database Clone is an open source PowerShell library. It's part of the SQL, I forget the name of what they call it, the SQL PowerShell Collaborative, the SQL Collaborative, I forget what they're called now, but the same sort of folks that build DBA tools. PS Database Clone, actually, credit to Sander Stead. Sander Stead is the guy that created this, and credit to him, it's great. Why did he create it? Well, he was actually going to go and buy Redgate SQL Clone, and then he saw the price and he realized what it was doing, and he said, I can build that for free. What it's doing is, well, the best way to explain it is actually this diagram in SQL Clone, because PS Database Clone doesn't have the same marketing budget as Redgate does. But this is basically doing the same thing as this. So Redgate SQL Clone server, you can interact with it through PowerShell or web client. What it's going to do is it's going to install an agent where your production databases are, or your backups are, or your masked production data set is. It's then going to create what's called an image. Now, this is a VHD, a virtual hard drive, that is somewhere on some big file storage that all of your developers have got access to. And then what we can, the clever bit is where we create a VHD differencing disk on the local machine of the developers, or on the workstation of the developers. And that local differencing disk basically just bounces back to the main file storage, a bit like VM snapshotting, actually almost exactly the same as VM snapshotting. It's the same deal. The MDF and LDF file, the big fat files, are saved in the big fat storage once, and then we just got thin copies on developer workstations. These are a few tens or hundreds of meg. They spin up almost instantly, just like my container did, and they take up next to no space on disk. All of the changes are stored in the shared location, but it's editable. How does that work? Well, all your changes are stored locally. So this is a really great solution for people who aren't doing massive number crunching, who aren't doing a lot of writes. So if what you're mainly doing is reading and updating stored procedures, then your local differencing disk is going to stay relatively small. If what you're about to do is start running massive ETL processes or masking sets that are about to churn lots of bits and bytes about, well, at that point, your local differencing disk is going to get pretty big pretty quickly. So not great for those use cases, but very good for general day-to-day development, most of the time, depending on what you're doing. When I said ETL is a bit scary, well, it kind of depends, right? So what a lot of people, when they're trying to do this, will do is think, well, how on earth do I do this for like a full ETL pipeline where I want to have consistent data all the way through it? Well, what you do is you start with your source database or your mirrors database or whatever, that source, the first one, the one on the left, or this way, according to the webcam. Actually, I've got no idea which way around you see my face, but this is my left. So we'll start with the one on the left. You create your masked data set for that. Then behind the production firewall, you see if you can do a complete load. Yeah, that takes a long time. That's an overnight task. That's a weekend task. Sure, you do it at the end. You do it at the end of your sprint, and then once you've got all of your databases fully populated, you then take a fresh image of all of the databases along. You now have a consistent database data set based on masked data. You can create all of your images, stick them in the file share, now with masked data. Now all your developers need to do is clone out each of those databases on their local machine, and they've got a fully functioning ETL pipeline with consistent data all the way through the size of your production system, but it's almost instant to spin up. And I'm going to show that to you now. Not the full ETL pipeline thing. I've left that for another day. I'm just going to do it with the Stack Overflow database. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm not going to use PS Database Clone, because I do appreciate it was in the abstract and I put my hands up. I tried to make it work. It didn't. Actually, I teamed up with Andrew Prusky because we submitted a session to Data Scotland a few weeks ago, which was a very similar session to this one. And we worked together on it. And so a few things were wrong with it. I found out after having got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to try and get this thing working, when I turned up at the venue pulling my hair out, that it wasn't working yet. Andrew said, oh yeah, I spoke to Sandra about that. Apparently the master branch doesn't work at the moment. You have to check out the dev branch from his GitHub. So that's already filling me with concerns. And also I can't delete anything with it. Like the deleting of clones doesn't work. They're hanging around forever and they're mounted to my disk drive. And the way in which we did manage to get it working using PS Database Clone. So we did manage to get it working. And Andrew has a script that he didn't want me to share, so I'm not going to, because he's not really happy sharing it in a recorded way. It's that hacky that we're not really happy to share it. But basically, what happens is we create the clone. We then, detach it from SQL Server. We then move it into a Docker volume, and then we reattach it inside the Docker container. It's a fairly step-by-step process, and we're not entirely certain whether or not it would work if the clone is on a different VM demo machine from the raw image itself, which kind of defeats the point of trying to save yourself space on your machine. So we kind of got it working, but we're not very confident about it. So what I wanted to say is I'm really excited about this project, and I think it can go a long, long way. And if this is something that excites you, I encourage you to get involved. It's open source, but it's just not yet there yet. And so I figured for that reason, I'm going to show you something that is there and does work really, really well, but you have to pay for it. But hey, you're using SQL Server anyway as your database platform. So if you really want free stuff, then go use Postgres. Cool. So we're going to use Redgate SQL Clone for this because it does work really well. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my GitHub profile, but I'm actually going to do that on a Jumpbox VM. So here we are into the VM where I have all the bits that I need installed. The first thing I'm going to do is play with GitHub. I said we're going to use some GitHub. So just to make it very, very clear, I am starting with, let's get rid of all of that stuff. I am starting with an empty repo. I am starting with nothing. So if I go to documents where I put my Git repos, I have I don't apparently, let's try and delete it. There we are. I now have an empty directory. I have nothing on my machine. And if I check out, if I look in Management Studio, on my local instance, apologies, I thought I had this pre-fired up. I apparently made a mistake. So let's connect to that. Yep, let's connect. And I have no databases apart from the SQL clone config backend database. And so I've got nothing on my machine right now. What I want to do is I want to check out my source code to this location. So here's a tip for all of you guys. Did you realize that you could go cmd, boom, and now my command prompt is open to the right location? If that's news to you, then you're welcome. The next thing I want to do is pull down my source code. So in my source code, I've got a bunch of databases, AdventureWorks, Stack Overflow, Worldwide Importers, and I've got a bunch of provision scripts. And I've been hopelessly disorganized about the way I've organized this, and I'm very sorry for that. As you've seen, I'm on the road with Data Relay and managing T-SQL Tuesday, and somewhere between that trying to do some client work as well. So I apologize for the fact this is a bit of a mess. But this is what I have in source control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this repo down to my machine. So there's my Git address. So I'm going to go Git clone and paste the link. And that is going to populate this directory with all of my source code. There it is. There we go. All of my source code is now on my machine. That includes a couple of things. I've got some provision scripts and I've got my databases. Let's take a look in here. So I've got a Visual Studio database project. I am not going to spend too much time teaching you guys how these things work. I'm going to show you them in use, but this is basically the way that we script out databases with the default functionality available from Microsoft. So this is my Visual Studio project. I can build it inside inside Visual Studio. That's going to create me this DAT pack down here. I also have another project here for the Stack Overflow database. Why do I want to use the Stack Overflow database? Because it's big and we want to look at some reasonably big stuff. And when I say big, I mean big in terms of what I can actually fit on a reasonable size demo VM. I don't actually want to, in order to demo this, I need to have a raw image of the full data set somewhere. And Stack Overflow, that's a reasonably big database, but it's not big to the point that I'm going to have to bankrupt myself to be able to afford to host it. Okay, so they're my database projects. If I wanted to, I could come into SQL Clone and create my clones, create my databases through here by clicking buttons. But that's really lame. I don't like clicking buttons. I'll show you what I've got in here. So I've got a few, I've got a few images already saved here. So I already have an image for Worldwide Importers, AdventureWorks, and Stack Overflow. And you can see the Stack Overflow image is 120 gig worth of data. So they're quite big and they are stored locally. In a real world environment, these would be on a file share somewhere. So I've got those images. I could create my clone by going through the UI, boring. But what I've done is I've created a script. So I'll just show you the script from source control, provision scripts. Provision with Redgate for GroupBy is the one we're going with here. And so you can see here, this isn't a huge amount of code. You'll see I've commented out the Worldwide Importers one because I had an issue with it this morning that I didn't have time to troubleshoot. But I've got AdventureWorks in here. So I'm grabbing the AdventureWorks image and the Stack Overflow image. And I'm saying I want to point at my local machine. And I want to build clones. I want a new clone for AdventureWorks and I want a new clone for Stack Overflow. And that's all I'm running. And it's insane how quick this runs. So if I go to my provision scripts and just type PowerShell in here this time. There we are, there's a PowerShell window, check that out. And I'm going to go provision with Redgate for GroupBy, run that, done. And there we are, I have provision for myself on my full local instance, a full fat Stack Overflow database and an AdventureWorks database. And because all of this trickery is at the operating system level, as far as SQL Server is concerned, it thinks it's a full fat version of the Stack Overflow database. And I mean, that was insane how quick that worked, right? And you want to know what? I can kill it just as quickly. I can go doom boom purge with Redgate for GroupBy, and they're gone. And there go my images. And those are full-size editable copies of the database. That's all very well and good and all. But what I want to do is start making some changes. Purge with Redgate for GroupBy, there we are. No, not purge, they don't exist. I want to provision with provision with Redgate for GroupBy, boom. There we are, and now they should come back. There we are. So they did go before, by the way. It was just Management Studio was hanging on me. Cool. So that's how crazy quick it can be to spin up images, create, to spin up clones, make some local changes on them. I could then check those back into my SSDT projects, and I could deploy them up to the cloud. But the final bit of the pudding.
Quick question, Alex, from Gary. You built the clones that fast. How long did the image creation take for a large DB?
The image creation takes a long time. So the image creation does take a long time. The amount of time the image creation will take is roughly as long as a backup restore, followed by whatever masking routines you're going to run. And bearing in mind those masking routines can take a long time as well, because, for example, if you've got foreign keys, you've probably got your source, I don't know, customers or patients table or whatever, and then you've got foreign keys on that in various other places, so then you need to go and do lots of lookups and things, and so those merge statement, and you've got all the indexing to think about, so those masking sets, be prepared for those to take a long time on a big data set. So a process that I would normally put in place is, let's say, for example, you work in sprints. Or if you don't work in sprints, maybe you take weekends. And what I would do is I'd say that at the end of your sprint, you'd run an overnight process that would purge, you probably want to have 2 images at any one time. You want to have current version and previous version. But anything older than that you don't want, because each previous version is adding to the amount of storage that you need. And you're going to need a big server for this. But the key is you only need it once. So you'd probably have a process that would knock off the oldest one, provision you a new set with up-to-date data, and then come Monday morning, all your developers know, kill all of your local databases, provision them fresh. And consequences of that, their clones might die, because if you kill the image that this clone is dependent on, that clone is dying. Any work saved on that clone, goodbye. You know what? I like it. I like it because it forces developers to check their code into source control. It forces developers, hey, look, if I've got some work that I've not finished yet, that's fine. Save it out as a script or something, okay? And it forces you to be rebuilding your dev environment regularly, which means the maximum amount of time it's going to take before an issue is found is the beginning of the next sprint. Now, of course, I want it to be quicker than that. I want you to be finding these issues as soon as you commit to source control. But hey, at least like forcing you to refresh your development environment every couple of weeks, that's not a bad start. So yeah, I really like this. It is a process that I would run on a cadence. Now, of course, how up-to-date do you want it to be? That's going to be a different question for everybody. How up-to-date do you need your data to be? Is last year's data good enough? Fine, you probably only need to do it once. But I think it's a good habit to get into the process of doing it on a regular basis anyway, because it just means this is an ongoing process at that point rather than something that gets done once and forgotten about. And it instills really, really good habits. So yeah, the imaging process is slow, probably runs on a weekly or fortnightly or monthly basis, whereas the creation of clones, they should be temporary and throwaway. Cool. So let's say I'm midway through doing some work. I've committed my changes to source control. I've only done it locally. I'm not ready to share it with the rest of the team yet. I've only done it locally, but my image has been respawned underneath me. What's going to happen there? Well, this works really well. So I've just provisioned myself a bunch of new databases. What I can also do using whatever deployment tooling you're using, we're using SSDT. I've got a, what did I call it? I can't remember what I called the script. Let's go and take a look. Let's go back.
Something world domination something.ps1.
Something along those lines, sure. Publish with SQL package. Now, all the different tools, you might be using DBUp for source control, you might be using SSDT for source control, you might be using Redgate for source control, you might be using Apex, you might be using whatever you're using, okay? You should be able to deploy from your source code to a local environment. And now what's happening here is I am Let's zoom in here. I'm just using SQL package.exe, which is the default out of the box thing that I might use to publish my DAT pack. So SQL package.exe, and I'm taking the DAT pack. I just built the databases earlier, so I've got that DAT pack for the AdventureWorks and Stack Overflow. I'm publishing it against the target clones, and I'm doing that on my local SQL Server instance. So if I come back to here and go, what do I call it? Publish databases with SQL package. I'm going to run that, and that's going to use my default database tooling to deploy the current version from source control against those images. Now remember, those images are full fat production-like versions from yesterday or last week. That means that every single time that every developer is respawning their environment locally, they're practicing the production deployment. So if they've done something daft, like throwing a cursor in there in a deployment script, then they're going to feel that pain in the development environment rather than in the production environment. And wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be amazing? So what this allows me to do, I mean, I'm not going to go through the effort of demoing it because it's a bit contrived and it would take some time. But for example, I'm using Git, right? So I can do my work on a feature branch. I can work on my feature branch. I can re-provision my environment so it looks like production. I can redeploy it, check it works. Every single time that I need to kind of take a fresh image and build my fresh clones, what I'm doing is spawning myself a new clone and redeploying the code from my feature branch. That means that by the time that I merge it with master, by the time that I submit my pull request, by the time that I push this up the chain to production, I've already got this. I already know that this is going to work on production because I've done it on a local dev database that looked exactly like production because it's an image that was taken from the last production backup minus a few masking scripts. So I don't know what you need to do to have more confidence in your production deployments. So these new technologies that look scary, containers, clones, all of this stuff that's putting this data in the development domain, it's amazing because it gives us a huge amount more confidence in our process. And it allows us to work together much, much more efficiently. So what is the relationship between developers and DBAs on this? Well, I think that developers and DBAs should work together to set up the process. They should work together to set up an automated process that provisions the images and makes the images available. But then developers should be self-service to provision their own local environments and look after them. And if they screw them up, throw them away and start again. That's the way that we should be working. That avoids developers shouting at DBAs when something goes wrong on dev and the DBAs are distracted on production. It frees up the DBAs to stop worrying about dev databases and focus on production. And it means that when the developers are shipping updates over the fence to production, they know it's going to work because they've tried it on a local environment that looks an awful lot like production before it went to production. These are all great things. It's a virtuous circle. And frankly, I don't know why more people aren't shouting about database, not just containers, but also clones. Now, the glaring thing that I missed out of this demo is throwing my clones into a container. I showed you containers at the beginning, and they were great. And I showed you clones at the end, and they're also great. What I really want is to spin up a container, put some clones into it. Redgate can't do that. Redgate can't do that yet, which is the thorn in, and believe me, they're fed up of me asking them to make it work, and I believe they're on the case. So they are genuinely looking at it. They're trying to make it work, and I think they'll have something out soon. What other options are available to you? Well, if you want to spend 10 times more money than Redgate, you can go and spend your money on something like Delphix, but most of us don't have pockets that big. There's also Windocs, which is in a similar sort of price point to Redgate, and it does offer this, although Andrew and I have played with that a bit before as well, and we've had mixed results with it. So it's pretty good. It does do the containers and clones thing, but there are a few things I don't like about it. So they don't use Docker containers. They've written their own container thing instead of Docker, which feels a bit to me like what's the word, when you're fighting against something that's inevitable, like Docker has won containers. Increasingly, Microsoft is kind of pushing Kubernetes as well, right? And so like Docker and Kubernetes is the way this stuff is going to go. So I'd be nervous about moving away from Docker. That's why I've not shown that. But I have to say, you can do containers with clones in Windocs, and also Windocs does support Windows Auth. So if you care about Active Directory integration, if you care about containers and clones combined for that genius git clone F5, boom, there I go, then Windocs may well have something to offer for you. So I'm not necessarily saying you shouldn't look at it. It is a genuine option. I do also have like an Azure DevOps pipeline that is running automated builds on the code that I've checked into source control. But I realized after I put together the workshop, I included it in the abstract that I was going to show you some Azure DevOps. I can if you like, but I realized that's actually a bit going off topic. So if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't have included that in the abstract, because I really want to focus on provisioning the dev databases. And that's what the core of my abstract was about. So I do have a build pipeline here. It's reading from my GitHub repository, and it's running builds, and it's basically just running MS build in the same way that you would do it locally. And if you want to, you can set up release pipelines and stuff as well. But I figured I was possibly trying to bite off more than I can chew by covering all of that. And that
question from Matt. I love having the dev environments local. Can you talk about what you do when it comes time to go to UAT? Do you have a fully licensed server for users to test outside of production?
So this is a question about licensing, I think. Well,
I guess that's where it's going, yeah.
Well, SQL Server Developer Edition is Developer Edition, and SQL Clone licenses based on how much data you have. So it doesn't care about where you put those clones. PS Database Clone is open source, so go wild. Docker is actually, I'm not even sure what the licensing terms are for Docker. I probably should know the answer to that one, but I've just realized I've actually got no idea how Docker is licensed.
Matt actually says, or just strategy. I think he's more looking for the strategy aspect.
Oh, strategy. So there are a whole bunch of cool use cases for containers and clones. So for clones, for example, I mean, it's not a bad tool to have in your pocket from a DR point of view to be able to spin up a production. I mean, it might be a couple of weeks out of date, but I mean, you saw how quickly we can spin that up. I mean, I'm sure there are better solutions out there. They'll give you more up-to-date data, and like you're going to have a data loss period of time. But as a short-term measure, being able to spin up a clone, like, I mean, there are genuine reasons why I could consider all sorts of use cases of containers and clones. Absolutely spinning up dev and test and UAT environments. We should be moving away. I mean, so I said, I've been talking about having a shared development environment. We should also be moving away from shared testing and UAT and staging servers. We should be spinning that stuff up on demand when we need it. All of the environments that we use throughout our pipeline, we want to be moving in the direction of automated infrastructure as code, right?
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And these are tools like the application developers. How many application developers still maintain a dev and a test and a production? Like, they have production and they spin up the other stuff as they need it, right? And we should be aspiring to do the same with databases. Yes, it's harder because bits and bytes are harder to move about, and because history and time are complicated with, especially with databases, and because rolling back databases is scary. But hopefully you're beginning to see here a bunch of tools that give you a bunch of options. Now, it's really early days for SQL Server in containers and SQL Server clones. In terms of what patterns and practices have I seen working, well, creating your images on a fortnightly or nightly or weekly schedule and spinning up your clones for dev uses, I've seen that it works amazingly. Beyond that, I mean, these are early days. This is bleeding edge. How do you want to use this? And absolutely, I think that using it for test and staging production test and staging use cases, I can absolutely see all sorts of opportunity there, and I think we're just scratching the surface of what this can do, and I wish more people were excited about it. Cool. Well, that pretty much brings me to the end of the presentation. So do we have any more questions?
Let me check. No. Something time zones. Yeah, no, I think we all agree that this was a really cool session. I for one enjoyed watching the different the thought processes. Let me see here. We have something in chat. Would be great if Microsoft had a cloning function in Azure database. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it would, right?
And Pablo says, awesome session, great tips. So I don't see any more questions actually, but I think we all agree that this was a really, really great session, and we're obviously very thankful for having you on GroupBy.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great privilege to be able to present on a platform like this, and I do appreciate it, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
So you're literally organizing and presenting at a conference and taking time out of your schedule to present at another conference.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I need to go back in a minute and help tear down, because in a minute we've got about half an hour till the last break, and then we need to tear down, put everything on the box into the bus and go to the next city and set it all up again tomorrow morning.
All right.
Can I do a pitch here for speakers? If you like the idea of data relay, submit a session for next year. Of course, we don't have a CFP yet because we're still doing this year, but we will be touring around the UK again, and that's open both to UK speakers and also international speakers who want to do a bit of a UK road trip, and we'll show you all of the conference centres of Great Britain. It's going to be great.